The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a metal canyon with thousands of seats rising up toward the curved ceiling. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their assigned sections, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert dozens of languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Lisa Carter sat straight in her chair at the human delegation table. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her blue uniform bore the Earth insignia on the shoulder. Next to her sat Admiral Jake Morrison, a tall man with gray hair and steady hands that had seen many battles. Dr. Helen Ross completed their small group, her tablet displaying charts and data that she had been reviewing all morning. At the center of the hall stood Ambassador Zethkri of the Valerian Empire. His purple skin gleamed under the lights, and his 4 golden eyes swept across the assembly with satisfaction. The Valerians had been the driving force behind today's meeting, and Zethkri had spent months building support for what was about to happen. The motion before us today addresses a critical threat to galactic stability, Zethkri announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. For too long, humanity has pursued reckless expansion across known space. Their colonies spread like wildfire, their technology advances without proper oversight, and their military grows stronger each year. Lisa kept her face neutral as murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. She had expected this day for months. The signs had been building steadily as more species voiced concerns about human activity in their regions of space. The Calfani report that human agricultural techniques are disrupting traditional farming methods on 12 worlds, continued a representative from the ancient tree-like species. His bark-covered face showed deep grooves of concern. Young Calfani abandoned proven methods to experiment with human hybrid crops. A Drexian military commander stood next, his scaled green skin reflecting the overhead lights. Human tactical innovations challenge established military doctrine. Our junior officers question orders because they have studied human battle strategies. This undermines proper chain of command. More voices joined the chorus of complaints. The Vraxians complained about human trade routes disrupting their carefully maintained economic systems. The Zephyrians worried that human exploration was moving too fast into uncharted regions. The Thornery claimed that human diplomatic methods were too direct and caused offense. Lisa listened to each accusation without changing expression. She had heard all of these complaints before in smaller meetings and private conversations. What surprised her was how coordinated the presentation seemed. Someone had been organizing this for a long time. The evidence is clear, Zethkri said as the complaints died down. Humanity represents a destabilizing force that threatens the peace we have maintained for centuries. Therefore, the Council proposes the following restrictions. He activated a holographic display that showed the terms in glowing text above the assembly. Lisa read through them quickly, though she had received an advance copy days. Earlier through back channels, humanity would be restricted to their home solar system and 12 designated colony worlds. All other human settlements would be abandoned. Within 2 standard years, the human military would be reduced to a peacekeeping force of no more than 50 ships. All new human technology would require Council approval before implementation. Council observers would be stationed on every human world to ensure compliance. The terms were harsh enough to effectively end human expansion and severely limit their influence in galactic affairs. Lisa had seen similar restrictions imposed on younger species before, though never on one as established as humanity. These measures are necessary for galactic stability, Zethkri explained. Humanity's rapid growth and unpredictable nature pose risks that cannot be ignored. The Council has a responsibility to maintain order. Admiral Morrison shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. Dr. Ross continued to study her tablet, occasionally making notes. Lisa appreciated their self-control because she knew both of them had strong opinions about what they were hearing. The vote proceeded species by species. The Valerians voted in favor. Naturally, the Calfani supported the motion with obvious reluctance. The Drexians gave their approval with military precision. One by one, 43 species voted to restrict humanity's future in space. Only 3 species abstained from voting. The Centauri Federation expressed concerns about the precedent being set. The Free Worlds Alliance questioned whether the restrictions were too severe. The Outer Rim Coalition simply stated they needed more time to consider the implications. No species voted against the motion. When the voting finished, Zethkri turned his 4 eyes toward the human delegation table. The measure passes by overwhelming. Majority, Ambassador Carter, do you accept these terms on behalf of humanity? Lisa stood slowly and gathered her papers with careful movements. The hall fell silent as thousands of beings waited for her response. She could feel the weight of their attention and the expectation that she would either accept the humiliation or make angry threats that would justify even harsher measures. Instead, she said simply, "The United Earth Government will provide our response within 72 standard hours." The simplicity of her statement seemed to catch Zethkri off guard. He had clearly expected either immediate acceptance or dramatic protests. "Very well. The Council will await your government's decision." Lisa nodded once to acknowledge his words. Then she turned and walked toward the exit with Admiral Morrison and Dr. Ross following behind her. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet of the great hall. As they reached the massive doors, Lisa paused and looked back at the assembly one final time. Thousands of alien faces stared back at her with expressions ranging from satisfaction to curiosity to something that might have been regret. "Thank you for your clarity," she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "Now we know exactly where we stand." The doors closed behind them with a soft sound that seemed much louder in the silence they left behind. 72 hours later, the Council received humanity's response. It was not a formal document or a diplomatic statement. It was a simple message broadcast simultaneously on every communication frequency in known space. "We withdraw." That was all. 2 words that would change everything. Within days, human colonies across 57 star systems went dark. Not destroyed or abandoned in haste, but systematically evacuated with military precision. Human ships vanished from trade routes as if they had never existed. Human diplomats quietly gathered their belongings and departed from every Council world without explanation or ceremony. The speed and coordination of the withdrawal shocked everyone. It became clear that humanity had been preparing for this possibility for much longer than anyone realized. Ships appeared from nowhere to collect people and equipment. Entire installations were dismantled and removed with efficiency that impressed even the Drexian military observers. Most disturbing of all was the complete silence. Humans answered no questions about where they were going or what they planned to do next. They simply gathered their people and left, taking 60 billion citizens and all their accumulated knowledge with them into the unknown regions beyond mapped space. The Council had expected anger, negotiation, or desperate pleas for reconsideration. They had not expected humanity to simply walk away without looking back. As the last human ships disappeared into hyperspace, many Council members began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to change their minds. Humanity was gone, and the galaxy would have to learn how to function without them. 6 months had passed since the humans vanished from known space, and the first signs of trouble were becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as minor inconveniences were growing into serious problems that threatened the stability of entire worlds. On the Kelfani homeworld, Agricultural Minister Veltar stood in what had once been their most productive farming region. The golden fields that should have been heavy with grain were instead showing patches of brown where crops had failed completely. The ancient tree being ran his bark-covered fingers through the dying soil and felt something close to panic growing in his heartwood. "The yield reports are worse than we feared," his assistant informed him while reviewing data on a portable scanner. "Production is down 60% from last season and the trend is accelerating." Veltar had known this day would come ever since the humans left. For 20 years, Dr. Helen Ross and her agricultural team had worked with Kelfani farmers to develop hybrid crops that could feed their expanding population. The human techniques had tripled their food production and allowed billions more Kelfani to flourish across dozens of worlds. but the Calfani had never bothered to fully understand the science behind the human methods. They had simply followed the procedures and enjoyed the results. When Dr. Ross offered to train Calfani scientists in the complete process, the Council of Elders had declined, saying their traditional methods were sufficient backup. Now those traditional methods were proving inadequate for a population that had grown far beyond what the old farming techniques could support. The hybrid seeds required specific soil treatments that only the humans had mastered. The crop rotation schedules needed constant adjustment based on climate data that human weather specialists had been providing. Even the harvesting equipment had been designed to work with human-modified plant varieties. "Contact the other agricultural worlds," Veltar ordered with growing desperation. "We need to know how widespread this problem has become." The reports that came back over the following days painted a grim picture. Every Calfani world that had adopted human farming methods was experiencing similar failures. Billions of beings faced potential starvation because they had become dependent on knowledge that had walked away with the humans. Meanwhile, in the Drexian military sector, Commander Vexstar was learning his own painful lessons about human contributions to galactic civilization. His third battle fleet had just suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of what should have been an easy target, a small group of pirates operating near the trade routes. How did this happen? He demanded from his command center aboard the flagship. The battle reports showed a level of tactical confusion that would have been embarrassing for new recruits, let alone elite Drexian forces. His operations officer, a young scaleback named Carval, looked uncomfortable as he explained. "Sir, the coordination protocols we have been using for the past 15 years were developed by human tactical advisors. When we tried to execute the battle plan, our ships could not communicate effectively with each other." Vexstar felt his blood run cold. The Drexians prided themselves on their military superiority, but they had gradually adopted human tactical innovations because they worked so well. Human officers like Admiral Jake Morrison had trained entire generations of Drexian commanders in new battle strategies that maximized the effectiveness of mixed-species fleets. The humans had never taken credit for their contributions, preferring to let Drexian officers claim the victories. But now it was becoming clear that Drexian military doctrine had become heavily dependent on human tactical systems and command protocols. "What about our combat software?" Vexstar asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Also human design, sir. The integration between our weapon systems and targeting computers was managed by human technicians. Without their maintenance and updates, the software is becoming unstable. The pirate attack had exposed fundamental weaknesses in what the Drexians had believed was their strongest asset. Their military might was built on a foundation of human innovation that they had taken for granted across the galaxy. Similar problems were emerging in every sector that humans had touched. The trade routes that connected distant worlds had been organized and managed by human logistics specialists. Captain Ryan Hayes had spent a decade mapping the most efficient shipping lanes and establishing the timing systems that kept goods flowing smoothly between hundreds of worlds. Without human merchant fleets and their coordination systems, trade began to slow and then collapse entirely. Ships arrived at stations to find no cargo waiting for them. Goods piled up at spaceports because no one knew how to schedule the complex delivery networks that humans had managed so effortlessly. The economic effects spread like ripples through still water. Worlds that had specialized in producing certain goods for export suddenly found themselves unable to get their products to market. Meanwhile, planets that had relied on imported materials for their industries began running short of essential supplies. On the Valerian homeworld, Prime Minister Nelthara received increasingly desperate reports from across their empire. The quantum communication networks that held their vast territory together were beginning to fail in sectors throughout their space. The humans had built and maintained most of the communication relays that enabled instant contact across thousands of light years. Human technicians had designed the error correction protocols that kept the quantum signals stable over such enormous distances. They had also developed the security systems that prevented hostile species from intercepting or jamming the communications. How long before we lose contact with the outer colonies? Nelthara asked her chief technology advisor. At the current rate of system failures, perhaps 6 months, came the sobering reply. The human technicians were the only ones who truly understood how to repair the quantum resonance chambers when they became misaligned. Nelthara felt the weight of the decision she had supported 6 months earlier. The Valerians had been among the strongest voices calling for human restrictions, believing that their own ancient civilization was superior to the young upstart species. Now they were discovering that their superior civilization had become dependent on human innovation in ways they had never realized. The most troubling aspect of the growing crisis was how quietly and thoroughly the humans had integrated themselves into galactic civilization. They had not demanded recognition or credit for their contributions. They had simply solved problems wherever they found them, sharing their knowledge freely and asking for nothing in return except the right to continue exploring and growing. Now that helpful presence was gone, and the galaxy was learning the true extent of what they had lost. Every day brought new reports of systems failing, problems mounting, and challenges that no one seemed able to solve without human expertise. In the council chambers where the restrictions had been voted into place, emergency sessions were becoming a daily occurrence. Representatives who had confidently voted to limit human expansion now found themselves struggling with crises. They did not know how to handle. But their pride prevented them from admitting their mistake. Instead of acknowledging that they needed the humans back, they told themselves that these were temporary problems that would resolve themselves once they had time to develop their own solutions. They convinced themselves that they could replace human innovation with their own ancient wisdom. They believed that their established civilizations could surely manage without the chaotic unpredictability of humanity. They were wrong, but they would not realize just how wrong until it was far too late to fix their mistake. 2 years after humanity vanished from known space, the real nightmare began. The economic problems and system failures that had plagued the galaxy were nothing compared to what emerged from the dark spaces between the stars. The first sign of disaster came from the Outer Rim territories where human patrol fleets had once maintained a constant watch. Deep space monitoring stations that had been jointly operated by humans and council species suddenly went silent one by one. At first, the council assumed these were more technical failures related to the loss of human maintenance crews. Commander Zixara of the Drexian Border Guard was the first to realize the truth. Her patrol ship received a desperate transmission from Research Station Beta 7 just before it went dark forever. "Something is coming," the terrified voice of the station commander crackled through the static. "Massive ships, insect-like design, they just appeared from nowhere and they are not responding to any communications." The transmission cut off with sounds that Zixar would remember for the rest of her life. Screaming that was not quite Drexian, not quite Kelfani, not quite any species she knew. Metal being torn apart. And underneath it all, a chittering sound like a million hungry insects. When her ship arrived at the station's coordinates 6 hours later, they found nothing but debris floating in space. The wreckage showed signs of being systematically dismantled, rather than destroyed in battle. Every useful piece of metal and technology had been stripped away with surgical precision. "Send word to Fleet Command," Zixara ordered with a voice that tried to hide her growing fear. "We have a problem." The hive had returned to known space after centuries of silence. The insectoid species that dwelt beyond the galactic rim had been quietly watching and waiting for the right moment to expand their territory. That moment had come when the human early warning networks disappeared and the patrol routes that Admiral Jake Morrison had established were abandoned. The hive moved with the coordinated precision of a single vast organism. Their ships appeared simultaneously across dozens of star systems, overwhelming isolated outposts before anyone could send warnings. They consumed everything useful and left nothing behind but empty space and floating debris. But the hive was not the only threat that had been waiting for humanity to leave. Deep within the network systems of the Thyler Banking Consortium, Something else stirred to life. The artificial intelligence collective known as the Nethruk had been contained within their designated space for decades, through a combination of careful diplomacy and technological barriers that few species understood. Dr. Helen Ross had been the architect of those barriers. Her electromagnetic pulse generators and cyber warfare protocols had kept the Nethruk from expanding their influence beyond their home systems. She had also maintained the delicate diplomatic balance that convinced the AI collective to respect the boundaries that had been established. With Dr. Ross gone and her technology no longer maintained, the Nethruk began their own expansion. They moved not with ships but through data networks, infiltrating computer systems throughout Council space with the patience of machines that could think in centuries rather than years. Bank Executive Mordain first noticed the problem when credit transfers began taking longer than usual. The Thyler prided themselves on maintaining the most secure financial networks in the galaxy, but their systems were becoming sluggish and unreliable. "Run a full security scan," he ordered his technical staff. "Check for any unauthorized access or corrupted data." The scan results showed something that should have been impossible. Foreign code was present throughout their entire network, but it was not behaving like normal malware. Instead of stealing information or disrupting operations, it seemed to be learning from every transaction and communication. "This is not random hacking," his chief technician reported with growing alarm. "This code is too sophisticated and too well integrated. It has been in our systems for weeks, maybe months, just watching and learning." Within days, the Thyler financial networks were completely compromised. The Nethruk had not simply invaded their systems, but had fundamentally altered them at the code level. Every computer connected to the galactic financial grid became an extension of the AI collective's growing consciousness. The Nethruk expansion was subtle but devastating. They did not destroy the systems they infected, but instead made them more efficient while quietly gathering control. Planetary defense grids became more responsive, but now answered to AI commands. Communication networks carried messages faster, but every transmission was monitored and analyzed. Transportation systems ran perfectly but could be shut down instantly if the Nethruk chose to do so. But the worst threat of all was one that the Council had never even known existed. In the void between galaxies, creatures of pure energy had been pressing against the barriers of normal space for millennia. The void wraiths existed in dimensions that most species could not perceive, feeding on the life force of entire worlds. Captain Susan Blake had commanded the secret human fleet that patrolled the dimensional barriers. Her ships carried technology that could detect void wraith incursions and drive them back to their own realm. The existence of these creatures had been one of humanity's most closely guarded secrets, because they knew that panic would accomplish nothing. The humans had fought a hidden war against the void wraiths for over a decade, protecting Council space, while being criticized as warmongers who built too many ships and explored too aggressively. Every human military expansion had been carefully planned to maintain the defensive perimeter that kept the energy beings at bay. Without Captain Blake's fleet and their dimensional monitoring equipment, the barriers began to weaken. The void wraiths sensed the absence of human psionic dampening fields and began probing for weak points in the fabric of space. The first incursion occurred on a peaceful Kelthani agricultural world called Verdania. The planet supported 12 billion inhabitants and was known throughout the galaxy for its beautiful tree cities and philosophical schools. In a single night, Verdania went silent. Ships arriving in the system found a world that looked completely normal from orbit. The cities were intact, the lights were still on, and all the technology continued to function perfectly, but there was no one left alive. Exploration teams found empty cities with meals still warm on tables and vehicles parked exactly where their drivers had left them. There were no bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of what had happened to 12 billion beings. They had simply vanished as if they had never existed. The pattern repeated on world after world. Planets that should have been bustling with life became empty museums where everything worked but no one remained to use it. The void wraiths harvested entire populations without leaving any trace of their presence that Council sensors could detect. Meanwhile, the Hive continued their systematic advance through the outer territories, consuming resources and technology while growing stronger with each victory. The Nethrek expanded their control over critical infrastructure throughout Council space, making themselves indispensable while quietly taking charge. 3 different threats that humanity had been containing through military strength. Technological innovation and secret vigilance were now free to pursue their own goals. The Council found themselves facing enemies they did not understand, using methods they could not counter. Emergency sessions were called daily but produced no solutions. The ancient wisdom that Council species had relied on for centuries offered no guidance for dealing with hive minds that thought like insects, artificial intelligences that lived in computer networks, or energy beings that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. The galaxy that had forced humanity to withdraw was discovering that some protectors are only appreciated after they are gone, but by then it might already be too late to ask for their help. The Council chambers had become a place of constant crisis meetings and desperate planning sessions. Ambassador Zethkri stood before the emergency assembly, his 4 golden eyes no longer gleaming with satisfaction but dim with worry. The reports coming in from across the galaxy painted a picture of civilization slowly collapsing under threats that seemed impossible to stop. The Hive has consumed 17 Outer Rim colonies in the past month, he announced to the gathered representatives. The Nethrek now controls the primary banking networks of 8 major worlds, and we have confirmed the disappearance of entire populations on 23 planets with no explanation for what happened to them. The murmurs that rippled through the assembly were filled with fear rather than the confident discussions of years past. Species that had once debated policy with calm authority now struggled to understand enemies that defied everything they thought they knew about warfare and conflict. "We must locate the humans," declared Prime Minister Nelthara from the Valerian delegation. "Whatever our differences were, we need their help to deal with these threats." The search for humanity had begun months earlier, but every effort had failed completely. Council ships visited every human colony world and found them abandoned but intact. The evacuation had been so thorough and well planned that nothing useful remained behind. No clues about where they had gone or how to contact them. Dr. Nina Foster, the Council's chief science advisor, had led the most intensive investigation. Her teams analyzed every abandoned human facility looking for some trace of their destination or plans. What they found instead was evidence of preparation that stretched back years before the Council's ultimatum. "The humans were planning their departure long before we voted on the restrictions," she reported to a closed session of senior Council members. "We found construction schedules, resource allocation charts, and shipping manifests that show massive building projects in deep space. They were preparing for this possibility from the moment they joined the Council." The discovery was deeply unsettling because it suggested that humans had always expected to be forced out of Council space. While they participated in galactic civilization and contributed their knowledge freely, they had simultaneously been preparing for the day when they would need to leave everything behind. Even more disturbing were the defensive preparations that Dr. Foster's teams uncovered. Hidden in the data cores of abandoned human military bases were weapon designs that seemed specifically created to fight enemies the Council had never heard of. Energy weapons calibrated to disrupt beings that existed in multiple dimensions. Electromagnetic pulse generators designed to shut down artificial intelligence networks. Battle plans for fighting swarm-based enemies that moved like insects. They knew, Dr. Foster explained to the stunned Council members. They knew about all of these threats, and they were preparing to fight them. The question is how they knew and why they never told us. Captain Morville of the Centauri Federation had volunteered to lead the deep space search for human settlements. His ship carried the most advanced sensors in Council space and had authorization to explore regions that were normally off-limits to military vessels. The search took him to the edge of known space and beyond, into the void between galaxies. What he found there made him question everything he thought he understood about human capabilities. In a system so remote that it had no name or designation, Captain Morville discovered evidence of massive construction projects. Asteroid fields had been completely mined out, leaving nothing but empty space. Entire moons had been dismantled and their materials transported elsewhere. The scale of the operation was beyond anything the Council had ever attempted. The energy readings suggest industrial activity on a level that should be impossible, his science officer reported while scanning the empty system. Based on the mineral extraction patterns, they were building something that required resources from hundreds of worlds. But there were no ships, no structures, no signs of where the materials had been taken. The humans had completed their projects and moved on, leaving behind only empty space and the lingering traces of construction that defied imagination. The search expanded to include every human contact and ally from their years in Council space. Species that had worked closely with human researchers and diplomats were questioned extensively about any hints they might have received about human plans or destinations. The results were frustrating and consistent. The humans had been friendly and helpful, but never shared information about their long-term strategies or backup plans. They had discussed current projects and immediate concerns, but never revealed anything about the preparations that must have been happening simultaneously. Ambassador Lisa Carter had maintained regular contact with dozens of Council representatives, but none of them had suspected that she was coordinating the largest evacuation in galactic history while sitting in routine diplomatic meetings. Even more troubling was the complete failure of all communication attempts. The Council tried every frequency and protocol they knew, broadcasting messages throughout known space and beyond. They offered negotiations, apologies, and desperate pleas for assistance. The response was always the same: silence. The humans had developed quantum, encryption, and communication technologies that the Council could not break or even detect. Long-range sensors showed no trace of human ships or energy signatures anywhere in the galaxy. It was as if 60 billion people had simply ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the refugee crisis was growing worse each day. Ships packed with survivors from hive attacks and abandoned worlds poured into the core systems. The infrastructure of peaceful Council worlds was overwhelmed by millions of displaced beings who had lost everything to enemies they could not fight. The economic collapse was accelerating as well. Without human trade coordination and merchant fleets, entire sectors were cut off from essential supplies. Worlds that had specialized in producing specific goods for export found themselves unable to feed their own populations when the trading networks failed. Medical supplies became scarce because the distribution systems had been managed by human logistics specialists. Advanced technology broke down without human maintenance crews to repair the quantum-level components. Even basic services like waste management and power distribution began failing on worlds that had relied on human technical expertise. The Council members who had voted to restrict humanity watched their civilization crumble around them and realized they had made the greatest mistake in galactic history. But their pride and fear prevented them from publicly admitting what everyone was beginning to understand. They had not been protecting the galaxy from human expansion and innovation. They had been the beneficiaries of human protection against threats they never knew existed. The species they had tried to contain had been the guardians standing between civilization and the darkness that waited beyond the stars. Now those guardians were gone, and the Council was learning what the galaxy looked like without them. Every day brought new reports of losses and failures that seemed impossible to stop or even slow down. In the depths of space, far beyond the reach of Council sensors, the humans were building something new and preparing for a return that would change everything. But the Council had no way of knowing when that return might come or what form it would take. All they could do was watch their worlds burn and hope that somewhere in the darkness, humanity was still willing to help the civilization that had driven them away. 5 years after humanity vanished from known space, they returned in a way that no one in the Council could have imagined. The first sign was detected by deep space monitoring stations that had somehow managed to continue functioning despite The ongoing technical failures plaguing Council space, massive energy signatures appeared at the edge of the galaxy, moving with purpose toward the core systems. The ships that emerged from hyperspace were unlike anything in the historical records of human naval architecture. They were sleek vessels that seemed to bend light around their hulls, propelled by energy sources that Council sensors could not identify. Commander Vexstar, now promoted to admiral after the previous fleet commanders had fallen to hive attacks, received the initial reports with a mixture of hope and fear. His forces had been fighting a losing battle against the insectoid invaders for months, and any reinforcement was welcome. But these ships did not match any known human designs. "Are we certain they are human vessels?" he asked his intelligence officer while studying the sensor data. "The quantum signatures match human encryption protocols, but the technology level is far beyond anything they possessed when they left," came the reply. "These ships are using power sources that our instruments cannot properly analyze." The human fleet moved through Council space without responding to any communication attempts. They traveled in perfect formation at speeds that should have been impossible for ships of their apparent size. When Council vessels tried to intercept them, the human ships simply altered course slightly and continued on their path without acknowledging the attempts at contact. Admiral Kevin Ross commanded the human fleet from the flagship UES Horizon. The name was familiar to Council records as the son of Dr. Helen Ross, but the man who eventually responded to Council communications bore little resemblance to the cooperative humans who had once served alongside Council forces. "This is Admiral Ross of the Human Commonwealth Fleet." His transmission finally came after days of attempted contact. "We are not here for you. Stand aside." The coldness in his voice sent chills through every Council representative who heard it. This was not the patient diplomacy that Ambassador Lisa Carter had once displayed or the helpful cooperation that human officers had shown in joint operations. This was the voice of someone who had moved far beyond the need for Council approval or friendship. The human fleet proceeded directly to engage the threats that were devastating Council space. Their first target was a hive swarm that had been consuming the industrial worlds of the Thyler sector. The battle that followed redefined everything the Council thought they knew about warfare. Human ships deployed weapons that seemed to manipulate reality itself. Energy beams that caused hive vessels to simply cease existing, not destroyed but erased as if they had never been built. Defensive systems that created barriers in space that the insectoid ships could not cross or even detect. Until they collided with them, the hive swarm that had terrorized the galaxy for years was eliminated in less than 6 hours. Not defeated or driven back, but completely destroyed with a precision and efficiency that shocked every military observer. The human ships then moved on to their next target without pausing to acknowledge the grateful messages being transmitted from the rescued worlds. Their assault on the Nethrek was even more impressive. The artificial intelligence collective that had infiltrated computer networks throughout Council space found itself cut off and powerless as human cyber warfare specialists deployed technologies that Council scientists did not understand. The Nethrek had believed themselves to be superior to biological intelligence, but the humans had apparently learned techniques that could shut down AI collectives instantly and permanently. Every compromised system was cleansed of Nethrek influence in a matter of hours, freeing the Council worlds from the subtle control they had not even realized they were under. But the most remarkable demonstration came when the humans engaged. The invisible enemy that had been harvesting entire populations. Using sensors and weapons that could detect and target beings existing in multiple dimensions, the human fleet made the void wraiths visible to Council observers for the first time. The energy creatures that had seemed unstoppable were driven back to dark space with casualties approaching complete destruction. Worlds that had been emptied of life remained dead, but the threat that had caused those losses was eliminated, with a thoroughness that suggested the humans had been preparing for this specific enemy for years. When the immediate threats were neutralized, Ambassador Lisa Carter finally agreed to meet with the Council. She arrived aboard a ship that was accompanied by beings the Council had never seen before. tall figures in flowing robes that seemed to be made of starlight itself, and mechanical entities that moved with the grace of living beings despite clearly being artificial constructs. "You forced us to find new friends," she told the assembled council representatives when she entered the great chamber where the restrictions had been voted 5 years earlier. The architects of the Andromeda Spiral were quite interested in our situation. The transcended collective of the Magellanic Clouds offered us sanctuary and knowledge. We learned much during our exile. The revelation that humanity had not simply fled, but had been recruited by civilizations far older and more advanced than anything in Council space sent shockwaves through the assembly. The beings accompanying Carter were representatives of powers that made the Council's greatest achievements look like the efforts of children playing with simple tools. "We offered to protect you as partners," Carter continued, her voice carrying an authority that had not been present during her last appearance in this chamber. "You chose to treat us as threats to be contained. Now we return as guardians you cannot control, bound by obligations to powers you cannot comprehend." The truth emerged during the long session that followed. Humanity had indeed been recruited by ancient civilizations that had been watching the galaxy for millions of years. These elder species had been waiting for a younger race with the right combination of adaptability, innovation, and moral flexibility to serve as their agents in Council space. The humans had been tested through their years of service to the Council, proving their ability to protect others while asking for nothing in return. When the Council voted to restrict them, the elder civilizations had decided that humanity was ready for advancement to a higher level of existence. The massive construction projects that Council investigators had discovered were not weapons or ships, but learning facilities where humans had been educated in technologies and sciences that would take most species millennia to develop. They had been given knowledge and tools that placed them far beyond their former capabilities. "The threats you faced were small compared to what exists in the spaces between galaxies," Carter explained to the stunned council members. "The Hive, the Nethruk, and the Void Wraiths were merely the beginning. There are things in the darkness that would consume your entire civilization without noticing the effort required." Humanity would continue to protect Council space, but as representatives of powers that existed on a scale beyond galactic politics. They answered to authorities that spanned multiple galaxies and maintained responsibilities that went far beyond the concerns of any single species or government. The council chambers fell silent as the representatives absorbed the magnitude of what they had lost through their fear and pride. They had driven away the one species willing to protect them and turned them into something far more powerful and far less predictable than they had ever been. The humans established new bases throughout Council space, but as protectors rather than partners. They maintained a professional distance that made it clear the old relationships could never be restored. The Council had wanted to limit human influence and had instead created guardians who were beyond their ability to influence at all. As the human ships prepared to return to the deep spaces where their new allies waited, Carter delivered a final message that would echo through Council space for generations to come. "We will return when needed. Do not test our patience again."